We're glad to be able to see everyone here this morning. And what I want to talk about this morning, well, let me start off with this. For those of you that may have heard me describe a lot of the things that I did while I was still working, I described my job as being like an old fishing hat that had the wedges on it. And every one of the wedges was a different color. So you could change, just turn it around your head and you'd have all these different colors. Well, I described my job as having different tasks that I could turn my hat and, there's a different task that I'm able to do. And then my job was so crazy hectic, I could turn the thing inside out and there's another set of tasks. So I had so many different responsibilities, and being able to do all those things, I considered it a privilege to be able to do as much as I was able to do in helping the folks there in the office area. As Christians, we're in a similar situation. If we take a look at Romans, the 12th chapter, verses 6 through 8, Paul writes and said, "Since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given us, each of us is to exercise them accordingly. If prophecy, according to the proportion of his faith. Is service, in his serving, or he who teaches in his teaching, or he who exhorts in his exhortation. He who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness." Paul is describing a number of different gifts that as Christians we may have been given one or more, if not all of these gifts. But then we use them, and it's almost like turning the hat so that we've got each of these different gifts that come to our forefront. And this is what we are going to be doing at the moment. This is what's necessary right now. Now, people wear hats for different reasons. Some hats are worn for protection, such as a construction worker's hat, the fireman's hat, a football player's helmet, or a soldier's helmet. They're to help protect the brain, protect the head from being injured. Others wear hats and are showing a different office or a different position. And again, we think of the hat that the police officer wears. The bus driver wears a hat to indicate that he's the driver of the bus. It's not as prominent as it used to be, but I remember when my mother first graduated from nursing school and they gave her her nurse's cap. And that was to show that she was in fact a nurse as compared to one of the aides that was working on the hall. Another thing that might be used as a hat to show a position is the crown that members of royalty will wear to show that they are in fact someone of high significance within that particular country. But we also think about another crown that was worn to show the significance of the life that was being given. That was the crown of thorns that our Lord wore. Other times we wear hats or things that are more functional, such as wearing a ski mask in the winter to protect our faces or protect our noses from getting so cold. A welder, when they are working, they have a face shield to protect themselves from being splattered by the slag that's coming away from the welding. Or a cowboy cap or cowboy hat that they will wear in the sun to protect them from all the heat, and also give them a little bit of shielding for their eyes to help protect their vision. All of these different hats indicate different roles. And as I was talking about my position at work, some of us wear more hats than just one because of who they are and what they do. And let's just think about a mother for an example. She's the chef, she's the chauffeur, she's a nurse, she's maid, and this and that, laundress, and the list just goes on and on. Or as husbands, we've got the responsibilities of breadwinner, of course, but then we've also got other responsibilities like taking care of the yard, carrying out the garbage, and so many different things. We've all got more than one job, more than one hat that we wear. But we all wear more than one hat based on the talents that God has given us. And with those hats, with those talents that God gives us, comes a responsibility to do the things that are expected of us in the Lord's kingdom. If we think about the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, one that we've heard so many different times, talents were given based on the individual's ability. This is brought out in verse 15 where Christ said, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and another 1, each according to his own ability, and then he went on his journey. The servants that the master was giving these responsibilities, these talents to, had different capabilities. And based on the way the talents were allocated, it seems that the 5-talent man may have had more capabilities than the 2-talent or the 1-talent man. But what about us, and what about the talents that we are given? We have hats, effectively, that are given to us by the Lord. Now these hats that are given to us will cause us to fill various roles in the Lord's work. Again, the passage that we quoted earlier in Romans 12 talks about the various gifts that we may have been given. But it also talks about the responsibility that we have, that we are to use these gifts. It doesn't matter what it is that the Lord has given us as a talent. It doesn't do us any good if we just take it and put it up on the shelf and it never gets used. There's another place where it talks about the gifts that were given, and they are given for the edification of the church, for the building up of the church. And if we stop and think about the hat being kind of a bricklayer, and each of us as building blocks, as bricks in the Lord's kingdom, if we fail to use our talent as a bricklayer and we're not putting the bricks where they need to be, what's going to happen to the building we're trying to build? It's either not going to be completed, or it's going to wind up being just a shamble because it wasn't done correctly. So, we've got to look at what we can do. But also, if we think back to the parable of the talents, each of those servants there gained additional talents. So we've got to look at our responsibility to gain talents as well. Now, the roles that we have been given are important for us because we are doing a responsibility. Okay? Now, we think back to many of the different things, if those of us that have been involved in any kind of acting, we're portraying a role, we're playing somebody's role. And if they happen to have a talent or something, they're portraying that talent. And I guess one of the things that is the easiest for us to think about in this, Ava and I like watching MASH in the evenings after the news comes on. And there are actors there who are portraying doctors, surgeons. But I at least feel that I've got enough wisdom that I'm not going to let an actor come at me with a scalpel because he knows how to act with it, but he doesn't know how to really do the surgeries. So we've got to think about this. Now, we also think about another use for the hats. Sometimes they're used as a disguise. A criminal may wear a ski mask to prevent someone from recognizing them. Others may wear a hat as a disguise to prevent us to recognize what they're doing. One of the plots that we see frequently in some of the television shows is where someone is coming onto a construction site to do some damage. And they come in, they're wearing the vest that everybody wears on construction sites now. They're wearing a hat. They're portraying the image of one of the construction workers who is supposed to be there. And again, we're thinking that there's just so many construction workers there. No one is going to recognize all of them by sight. So I can get away with doing what I want to because I look the part. I look like a construction worker. And then I can get in there and tinker with things and cause damage. But the responsibility that we have as Christians includes one very important hat that we all wear. And that is the hat of being an example. In Titus, the 2nd chapter and the 7th verse, in all things show yourself to be an example by good deeds, in purity, or with purity and doctrine, and dignified. A responsibility that we as Christians have to set an example so that people who are looking at members of the Lord's church can see that there is a uniqueness about us. We are not like others. I know that many of us have seen people that maybe we work with them, or our friends or our neighbors. They claim to be a Christian because they are a member of so and such church over here. And we may see them go to services on Sunday. But the way that they conduct themselves the rest of the week, you really wouldn't recognize them as being, quote unquote, a Christian. Their conduct is just not acceptable. Maybe they go out and they get drunk all the time, but they're going to be at services. Maybe they're taking extra funds or taking extra time at work, and they're actually stealing from their work by the way that they're doing things. But they're going to be at services on Sunday. And they claim to be an example of what you should follow. And yet when you look at this, the example they're really setting is not one of a true Christian. And it doesn't matter what our age is. In fact, when Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy, the 4th chapter and the 12th verse, he said, "Let no one look down on your youthfulness, but rather in your speech, in conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example of those who believe." We can present something that is so unique that those around us who think they're Christians will see that there is a uniqueness about us. And that's what we are supposed to be doing. We are supposed to be setting an example that encourages others to try to look at us as someone that they can follow in their example. And this is something that Paul says in a sense in 2 Corinthians 11th chapter verses 12 through 15 when he says, "But what I am doing I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. For such men are false prophets, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds." We were talking about some of the hats that were used as disguises. Satan even disguises himself. And the way that he does this, he's trying to make himself seem like what a Christian should be. He's describing himself as an angel of light. But we can see there is a difference. That's not what he really is. When you look at his core, it's rotten to the core. When we look at some of the ones around us who claim to be Christians, and yet the way that they conduct themselves daily is not a good example of what a Christian should be. We need to prove ourselves different. And so what we look at as we see a lot of these people around us who are teaching things and the way that they are conducting themselves is really not appropriate, that they are individuals who are disguising themselves as a true servant, and they're really not. And it even happens within the Lord's church. And so again, we have to look at ourselves and make sure that we are conducting ourselves appropriately. But there are many people who teach error within the Lord's church who are actually Satan's servants. And Peter warns about them in 2 Peter, the second chapter and the first verse. He says, "But false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves." These people are false teachers, false prophets. And again, I go back to the idea of the television actors or the movie actors. They are portraying themselves in a role and hoping that we buy their act, that we are willing to accept them as being a Christian when they're truly not. When we do make the decision in our life that we are going to serve God and serve Christ, there's got to be a change in us. Now in Romans, the 12th chapter, the first 8 verses, it talks about this transition that we make in our lives. And the second verse includes the phrase, "but be transformed." I guess the easiest description I can come up with at the moment is whenever we take all the ingredients for a cake and we put them in a bowl and we stir it up. The flour, the eggs, the sugar, all of it comes in and it becomes transformed into something totally different than what they were before. We need to be transformed as well. And the change is going to make us into a new person. We are no longer play acting or role playing as being a Christian, because we're now doing it from our heart. We are a Christian. And as Paul wrote there in Romans 12, in the 6th verse, he says that since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given us, each is to exercise them accordingly. These gifts are given to us by God for us to use them. Now, some people feel that, okay, when I get the gift of the Holy Spirit, I've got everything. There are some within the Lord's church who can do more things than others. But sometimes we may be limited to just one or two things of which we're capable. And Paul is talking about that in 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter, verse 7 verses of the chapter. And he says, beginning in the 4th verse, now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of ministries, and the same Lord. There are varieties of effects, but the same God works all things in all persons. But to each one is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. These gifts are given to help each other. The things that I have been given, I try to use and share with you and do the things that I can to help you. And the things that you have been given, you try to serve and help me and help each other. But we've got to remember this. In verse 11 there in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul wrote and said, but one and the same Spirit works all these things, distributing to each one individually just as he wills. The Spirit of God is deciding who gets what gifts, who has what abilities, and then we're to use them. Paul also wrote a little bit later in 1 Corinthians in the 14th chapter and the 12th verse, but also you, since you are zealous of spiritual gifts, seek to abound for the edification of the church. As Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, he's also writing to us. There are different things that you and I would love to be able to do in serving the Lord. And so we want these gifts. We want more. We want to be able to do more. But again, he reminds us, seek to abound for the edification of the church. We're kind of a small group here at Kempner. And we hope and pray that within our number here, we have all of the talents, all of the gifts that we need for the work to continue to grow. Maybe not necessarily in number, but we at least want to grow in our spiritual understanding and our service to God, doing whatever we can. But we've got to use those helping each other. And so we think about the hats that God has given us. The hat or hats that God has given you. Do we just take that hat and hang it on the hat rack and let it be there just for show, but we never use it? Or do we just take and put it on the hat rack because we don't want to use the gift that God has given us? We've got to remember, as the Spirit gives to each according to his, as he sees fit, just as he wills, God said, you have a reason for the talent you have been given. There is a reason I have been given what few talents I have. But I try to use them to serve. God wants us to use these talents to serve. So we've got to remember, God gave us the hats that we have for a reason. And we've got to look around at first off, what hat have I been given, and am I using it as I should? This morning, if you realize that you have an ability, a talent, and you're not using it to serve God as you should, and you want to make a change and begin serving Him as you should, but you need help, the opportunity is available, and we'll do what we can to help you. Or if you've never begun using your talents to serve God, you can't start any earlier. It's better to go on and start now while you have the opportunity. If there's any kind of a response that you need to make to the invitation that the Lord gives you, we encourage you to let us know what we can do to help you as we stand and sing our song of invitation.